Hello, and welcome to a module dedicated to active listening and what does it mean to actually be an effective or active listener. We're going to cover off a couple of different things in this module. One is recognizing the impact of conflict and our ability to effectively listen. It's also thinking about what do I bring to this conversation in terms of my presentation of being an active listener, as well as what do I need to pay attention to in terms of listening to the other. So this can take on a number of different components related to the tone of their voice, the nonverbal presentation, as well as the words that they're using. So appreciate that when we are trying to work through a situation with the other party, our ability to demonstrate to this person that we care, we are engaged, and we're wanting to understand starts to lessen the anxiety that this individual is going to have based on this particular situation. This goes back to some of the other modules that we've talked about, which is looking at conflict and how people come into conflict. Remember, conflict isn't easy for people, and that for many people there's this tendency to approach conflict from more of this adversarial orientation. You know, that right and wrong, win and lose, and good and bad. It's also recognizing that our histories related to conflict also come into play in terms of these conversations. So when I think about what am I paying attention to in these conversations of engagement, I want to make sure that I am available, that I'm paying attention to how this person is presenting themselves, that I have a degree of what I would describe as trauma-informed practice, which is considering what kind of histories do they bring to these conversations that I may not be aware of. And that when we're more present and we're more aware of the dynamic, we can start to see behavior play out in a way in which we have what I would hope to be more of an empathic ear. Not necessarily this reactive tendency to feel as though I have to defend or justify. So with that being said, let's start with what does it mean in terms of the dynamic of actively listening. Well, the first thing is I think it's helpful to recognize that when we're in these conversations is if someone is getting triggered emotionally and they start to move into what might be described as more of this fight or flight tendency, and we'll talk more about that in a future module. It's recognizing, though, that there are a number of different things that can happen based on the level of escalation. One is that the ability to process information diminishes, the auditory diminishes, and what goes up is the visual. So what this person is seeing based on you as the active listener. That's where the attunement is going to be, which then creates this opportunity for us to recognize that dynamic and how do we come into this conversation. What are we thinking about in terms of our nonverbal presentation? Because that's going to be a big component of what they're hearing and what they're seeing in us. So in order to try to maintain this comfortable environment, or as comfortable as it possibly can be, our engagement with this other person, I think, is a critical component. So being comfortable, being confident, being supportive, not demonstrating any kind of sense of feeling threatened by your presence is going to be important. So when emotions start to get high, because the visual is up, that's going to be a lot of the message that they're going to hear. And so even though we're not necessarily speaking at this point because we're in this active listening role, we want to engage with them. We want to let them know that we do care. So we're going to be paying attention in terms of, we're going to be presenting in terms of our eye contact, facial expressions, those things which are this opportunity of openness, of curiosity. So we're looking at that in terms of what we're going to be thinking about in terms of just how we enter into this conversation. I think it's also helpful to recognize too that when we're aware of sort of our presence and we're aware of our physiological response and what's happening, and we're aware of our internal monologue, self-talk, We can address those through self-regulation. And again, we're going to spend more time talking about those in future videos, but I think it's helpful to recognize that if I'm having a physiological response and my heart rate's starting to beat, my prefrontal is probably not going to be as engaged as I'd like it to be. So taking a moment to recognize that, taking some deep breaths, regrounding myself is going to allow me to be able to process information. It's also recognizing too that if I've got some internal negative messages about myself or the other party, and I'm not doing anything about that, that can also be a distraction to my ability to be an effective or active listener as well too. So we're starting to sort of set the groundwork here in terms of what does it mean to be engaging with this individual in an effective manner. Now, with respect to active listening as well, what we're wanting to now start to consider in terms of the other party is we're trying to be as focused as we possibly can in terms of their message. What I mean by that is that in this moment, we're trying to suspend any other thoughts in terms of what we want to present. This is why it might be helpful sometimes, depending on the conversation, is to perhaps have some notes. But of course, that's a process issue that needs to be talked about with the other party. What's the intention behind that? What's going to happen with these notes or whatever sort of conversation you're putting down onto paper here, is it's going to be helpful for them to understand exactly what's going on here. We want to, again, mitigate any kind of threat. So it may be something as simple as saying to the other party, you know, what's helpful for me is I like to jot down whatever you're saying that I want to be sure of, that I want to be clear about, or anything that I want to follow up on, because that way there it allows me to be as present as I possibly can with you. And that's the purpose of it. So I want to create some transparency of process. So here we are, we're in this conversation, we're wanting to hear what they have to say, we're suspending any kind of conversation with them or in terms of engagement, we want to allow them to say what they need to say. So for some of us, if we're, let's say for example, in an organizational conversation with someone, and let's say you've been doing the work a long time, as somebody starts to speak about their concern or their issue, it wouldn't be, I think, unusual that all of a sudden as they start to talk about something that these file folders of history for you now start to open up. And now in your head you can be distracted by thinking about, okay, so I'm hearing this, I'm thinking it's about this, or I'm thinking it's about this, or I'm thinking this information is going to be helpful for them. And so now all of a sudden we're starting to formulate our response while they're still speaking. Appreciate that. Acknowledge that for yourself and suspend that for the moment. Again, be present. If we come in too quickly with what we think is an appropriate solution to this situation or information that they need, that becomes an interruption to their narrative, to their experience. And now all of a sudden they can start to feel disrespected, not feeling heard. And so again, even though there can be a good intention behind what we're trying to do, ease the suffering, speed up this conversation, it again is going to interfere with them feeling heard and understood. So recognize that information is going to be invaluable. It's the timing of when you put that information out there for the other party. So we're going to be patient. We're going to go slow. We're going to be present. We're not thinking about what am I going to cook for dinner tonight, or what's the next thing I have to do here, or thinking about my schedule. We're just being in the moment. As I said earlier, we're not jumping to solutions. We just want to focus on what they have to say. We can do some non-verbal encourager, such as a head nod. We can do, in terms of our presence, this ability to demonstrate that we're connected in terms of, okay, right? So we want to continue to engage, but without getting into our stuff at this point in time. So we're now setting the parameters in terms of what we're not going to do, but what we are going to do is to not only listen to what they say, we're going to listen to the words they use. So sometimes when people speak, they speak in generalities, or they speak in labels. And that can make real sense to the person who's giving us the information, But if someone uses the word unprofessional or feeling disrespected, if we don't have any other information related to that, we can have a completely different interpretation of what that means. So that's a good place to jot down what that word is, or to in some way go back to that so we get more clarity. Because again, we want to understand specifically what they're saying in terms of their experience. So we're listening to those words, we're making sure we're clear about what they're saying. Then we're going to listen to the tone, because the tone's going to give us some information in terms of how they're emotionally being impacted by what's going on. The emotional experience isn't always as clearly articulated as more of the substantive experience, and so I think it's helpful to recognize what that emotional experience is and then being able to go back to and acknowledge that. We also want to pay attention to the nonverbals, because the nonverbals can be a big component of what they're trying to say. So paying attention to that as well too, and being able to again follow up on that, or to recognize that the nonverbal can also be related to or associated with the tone. And again, it's giving us a different experience other than just the substantive component. I think it's also helpful to consider that when people are presenting in this nonverbal manner, is how do we address that? How do we tap into that? Because again, we don't want to come in with the judgments, but we want to be able to again recognize that there's something here that may be a disconnect. A disconnect meaning looking at the conversation through congruency. So is what they're saying aligned with how it's being presented? Congruency is based on those three components: the words, the tone of voice, and the nonverbal. If something's out of sync there's an opportunity to investigate that and to get into more curiosity when we start to understand the other party. But again, coming back to actively listening, we're considering all of those different pieces, and we're really trying to create a space for them to be able to say what they have to say without interruption. And in doing so, they're now feeling heard, or at least at this point, they're feeling as though they're able to say what they need to say. That goes a long way. I think that many of us have experienced conversations that become more conflicted based on statement and react. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. And so when people are presented with this opportunity to fully self-disclose, it's a different experience. And in doing so, it starts to mitigate the anxiety. It starts to feel as though they're validated, just in terms of being able to self-express. That goes a long way in terms of even de-escalating the emotional intensity of the other party. So appreciate that when you're doing this, what we're trying to do is to not only demonstrate that we're committed to what it is they have to say, but it can also be a wonderful tool in terms of de-escalating the emotional intensity of the other party. So go slowly here. Take your time. It's important to make sure that this person feels heard and understood. Now, certainly there can be other challenges in terms of how this person self-discloses and what they say that may require you to intervene in a more timely manner. So if you feel that what they're saying or how they're saying it is disrespectful, challenging, distracting, then I think it's important to be able to come into that conversation in a timely manner. Because now we're probably dealing with behavior that is not necessarily just emotion. Let's say, for example, the emotion of anger or frustration. We can now start to be experiencing what would be described as hostility. And hostility becomes any kind of directed ill will towards you. So when that starts to happen, it makes it difficult to actively listen. So when those challenges come up, it's important to be able to recognize how I'm being impacted, and then what do I say or do to inform the other party. Again, that's going to be something else that we're going to talk about in a future segment. But as a quick example, if someone's using the F word and you find that quite upsetting or distracting, we can go through what might be described as more of an ADESO script: acknowledge, describe, express, specify, and outcome. In here, what I could say is something along the lines of, I'm hearing a lot of concerns right now with this situation, and when I hear the F word, I just find it really distracting. What works better for me is to understand what those concerns are without that, so that I can better appreciate where you're coming from. So what else do I need to know? And so we're creating that opportunity of influence and information to the other party that hopefully they can make the adjustment so that I can continue to do the effective active listening that I want to do. So those are the kind of basics in terms of actively listening. So pay attention to yourself in terms of your ability to be present in order to be effective, in order to be receptive. Pay attention to how you enter into this conversation non-verbally, not a threat, open posture, soft facial expressions, eye contact. Recognize the dynamic in the other person. What is it that they're saying? Is there anything I need to get more clarity on? For example, generalizations or labels. Not taking things at face value. Being able to recognize a process concern, which may be that for you it may be helpful to take some notes so that you can be more present and effective in terms of actively listening. And always trying to create the space in which the person can say what they need to say without interruption. Recognize that it's easy to get into our head and start to think about solutions, start to think about our retort to what it is they're saying, and we're going to hold off on that. We're going to recognize that at this point in time, there's something important that I need to understand. There's an experience here that's going to be helpful for me to recognize and appreciate. Some of this may be things that I need to own. And again, people are doing the best they can with what they've got in these situations, and they may not be as effective and as assertive and as clear and as respectful as we'd like them to be. That's just where they're at. So a degree of empathy, a degree of compassion allows us to be the most effective we can. That creates a nice tone, starts to build capacity, starts to allow this person to feel heard, understood, and validated. In the next video, we're going to talk about paraphrasing and what does that mean in terms of our reflective practice based on how we're listening to what it is they have to say. Thanks so much.